Thanks for tuning in to the Abiding Presence podcast with Gary Funk. You can reach Gary at theupperroomfamily@gmail.com.
Well, hello there, and welcome to the Abiding Presence podcast once again. And I sure hope that you're finding it to be true in your lives, that in the presence of the Lord there is fullness of joy, and that at his right hand there are indeed pleasures forevermore. And you know, it's from this place of presence that I want to continue our discussion with episode 3 of our series on divorce, remarriage, and the grace of God. And you know, I don't want this to be just another, a theoretical or a theological discussion that just fills up our heads with interesting and cool ideas. This really needs to help us plant our feet firmly on the ground so that we can be better equipped practically, to face the real life issues and the real life brokenness as these things play out in our broken world. So today is when we really start digging into the Bible to see what we can learn from the scriptures themselves on this subject of divorce and remarriage. And so in this session today, we're going to look at divorce and remarriage in the Old Testament. And then next time, we're going to look at the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament, okay? Now, I realize that many teachings on divorce and remarriage start with the teachings of Jesus. And I want to explain why I'm choosing a different path in this series. We know that from Jesus' own teachings that he has the highest authority, right? This means that Jesus alone has the last word on any matter. But like I mentioned in my list of assumptions in our previous session, you might remember, Jesus was speaking into a culture that assumed things about divorce that are honestly quite foreign to most of us. And the things that the people of his time assumed to be true were really based on or embedded in an Old Testament understanding of divorce and remarriage. So we have to remember that Jesus is speaking to literally centuries of cultural and theological assumptions here, okay? And once we understand the culture that Jesus was speaking into, then we have a whole new lens through which we can see and understand his teachings as well. And so unless we start with what Jesus' audience assumed to be true, we might misunderstand his teachings and then, just apply them in harmful ways to situations in our lives today. And I don't know about you, but I do not want to twist any of Jesus' teachings and then apply them in ways that don't accurately reflect his heart and that just might end up hurting people even more than they are hurting already. So one other thing I want us to remember is that we are not studying the Old Testament law because that law is our standard for living, okay? Because we know that as believers, we are not under the law. But as I said earlier, studying this will still give us a very valuable foundation so that we can better understand what's happening hundreds of years later when Jesus shows up to embody grace and truth in a way that had never been done before. So my friends, take a deep breath, and together, let's dive into the Old Testament world. Okay, here we are. We landed in the Old Testament. And to tell you the truth, the Old Testament actually says very little about divorce, but it assumes that it will happen, okay? Probably the most instructive passage on divorce and remarriage in the Old Testament is found in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 to 4. And it's for this part, I think it's probably the most helpful if you're also reading this for yourself as we discuss it. You'll probably get the most out of it. So I'm going to read that passage for you from the NIV, okay? Deuteronomy 24, verse 1 to 4 says, "If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house, she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to remarry her again after she has been defiled." So let's unpack this passage a bit further and see what's all being said here, because there's some really interesting stuff here. Now, I'm going to make 5 observations here that I hope that you also are going to find pretty interesting, okay? Let's start with number 1. The first thing that I want to point out here kind of ties in again to one of my assumptions that I shared with you in our last episode, where I said that having only a modern understanding of marriage and divorce will not be very helpful for us to understand the ancient Jewish customs that we read about in our Bibles, okay? I mentioned back then that the husband had all the power on his side in that patriarchal type culture, okay? And on top of that, marriages were generally arranged, which means that fathers and men, they basically decided the woman's future in terms of who she would marry and spend her life with. And to top it all off, when a man got married, it was often as much a business transaction as anything else. I mean, the man had to even pay a bride price, right? That's how it was back then, or a dowry, it was called, to the bride's father. And it kind of further supports the whole idea that women were seen a little bit more like property to be acquired rather than equals to be loved and cherished, okay? Now, this isn't to say that there wasn't any love between married couples back then, but love and romance don't seem to have been the primary driving factors in terms of what got marriages started back then. Not every situation was like Jacob and Rachel, where Jacob worked for years to earn the right to marry Rachel because of his deep love for her. I mean, that's probably one of the most touching romance stories in the entire Bible, as far as I know of. But in any case, the first point that I want to make about this Deuteronomy passage is that a man could divorce his wife by giving her an official certificate of divorce and by sending her away. The important thing here is there were 2 steps involved, and these 2 steps had to be followed in order to make it official, and this is a big deal. There had to be a certificate of divorce given to the wife, and then there was a sending away. And in fact, if you look at this ancient text in the original Hebrew language, there are 2 distinct words in the ancient Hebrew language to describe each of these steps, and both of these words are used in this passage. We have the Hebrew word shalach, which means to send away, okay? And then there's the Hebrew word kerathuth, which literally means divorcement or divorce. And so we see this 2-step process spelt out twice in this short passage that we just read. Can you see that? So whenever you're reading about divorce in the Bible, maybe ask yourself a question about whether the English version that you're reading is actually reflecting what you are assuming, okay? Now, the question that you might want to ask yourself is, could it be possible that not every usage of the English word divorce in your Bible means what you think it means, okay? So keep that question in mind as you reflect and study this deeper on your own, okay? Now, the Jewish certificate of divorce was called a get in Hebrew, G-E-T, get. And there are all kinds of ancient Jewish writings out there on how this legality, had to be carried out, right? There's a proper way of doing it. And so there's this process that the husband followed, and the details of that process very likely changed and evolved over the centuries, okay? And many of these procedures, these legalities, they're described in quite a bit of detail in the Jewish Talmud or the Mishnah, okay? And we won't get into any of that stuff in this series, but you want to be aware that there is a whole ton of Jewish writings out there that were written around the time of Jesus, probably just before, and even for several hundred years after, that tried to help people to correctly apply the law of Moses to their lives. And this included knowing the right way how to dissolve a marriage, okay? So the practice of a man simply sending away his wife was not an official or a valid divorce. There had to be an official certificate of divorce along with the sending away. Now, number 2 is a mind bender for many people, but I trust that you'll be able to process this if you give yourself some time to let this all soak in, all right? Now, according to the law that we just read, once a woman received her certificate of divorce or her get from her husband and was sent away, that woman was then free to remarry. She was not sinning and she was not committing adultery by remarrying after such a divorce. Now think about it. If this act of remarriage was in fact adulterous, then the command of Leviticus 20 verse 10 would certainly apply, right? Which commands that anyone who was found committing adultery must be stoned to death. So obviously, this remarriage that we're reading about here in Deuteronomy chapter 24, right in front of us, was not adulterous because these women were being allowed to live. Now, this is very critical to understand. And after hearing this for the first time, some people might get a bit of a brain cramp. This may not sit right with them. And this is especially true if the camp that you came from taught you that remarriage was always adulterous and always wrong, okay? Well, the Old Testament law seems to be quite clear that if a husband sent away his wife with an official get or an official certificate of divorce, she was completely free in this regard. Now, if this part doesn't make sense to you, maybe take a break, study this passage more carefully for yourself. And if you end up doing any extra reading on the history of the ancient Jewish cultures and their divorce practices, this is exactly what you're going to find, okay? And until you have peace with this biblical piece of news, you might have hang-ups in other areas of this discussion as well. So take your time, process this through slowly, and just understand that this is really my second point, that divorced spouses were allowed to remarry and it was not adulterous. So if that makes your head spin, you might want to grab another cup of coffee and pull your chair in a little closer to the fireplace, because what's coming up is even more interesting than this. Okay, now the third point that I want to highlight for you has to do with the reasons for getting a divorce, okay? So the first verse of our passage here reads that if a wife becomes displeasing to the man because he finds something indecent about her. Now, the Hebrew word for indecent here is ervah, E-R-V-A-H, ervah. And its literal translation means nakedness. Now, if you plug that English word into this sentence, it makes no sense at all, which is why most modern translations that we read use the English word indecent. I mean, the ISV version uses the word objectionable, but ervah has also been understood to figuratively refer to any type of blemish or disgrace as determined by the husband, okay? So some have taken the term ervah to refer to a literal nakedness and then make that to be a reference to some, sexual infidelity or adultery on the part of the woman. But, as I just mentioned in my second point, there are good reasons to believe that adultery is probably not the most accurate understanding here, since the law was very clear in Leviticus 20 verse 10 and also in Deuteronomy 22 verse 22 that anyone caught in the act of adultery was to be stoned to death. So we need to understand that in Moses' day, adultery didn't lead to divorce, it led to death, at least if they followed the law the way they were supposed to. Now, Bible historians have told us that there is no way of knowing for sure how meticulously this death penalty was ever followed or how it was applied, so we don't actually know. But that's how it's written, okay? What we do know from history, though, is that by the time of Jesus, centuries later, the death penalty was not being practiced in this way, because when Palestine became a Roman province just before the time of Jesus, the Roman authorities made it illegal for the Jewish people to carry out the death penalty for any religious reasons. And we even see evidence of this in John chapter 18 when Jesus is on trial before Pilate, where Pilate said to the Jews, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." But they objected and said, "But we have no right to execute anyone." So, when you consider this legal change that occurred in the New Testament time, around the time of Jesus there, it would naturally follow that in the New Testament era, adultery could possibly have fit into this category of indecency that we are talking about here. But if we go back to Moses' time, the word indecency probably meant things that were far less serious than adultery, okay? In fact, the rabbis in Jesus' day were vigorously debating this exact passage from Deuteronomy. They were asking themselves and arguing amongst themselves, what did indecent really mean in the law? I mean, the word itself is pretty vague, right? And did you know that at the time of Jesus, there were two main rabbinical schools of thought on this matter? And it's very likely that these two main views that they were debating were already hundreds of years old at that time. The first was the view came from the school of Rabbi Shammai. And he was one of the stricter, more conservative rabbis. And his school of students interpreted this word indecent to mean adultery specifically. So we know that this view considered the fact that the death penalty for adultery was not in operation anymore. So the school of Shammai believed that divorce was allowable if the woman had been sexually unfaithful to her husband, and only for that reason. And then there was the school of Rabbi Hillel, and this was the more liberal school, you might say, and they interpreted this word indecent to refer to anything about his wife that the husband had objections to, okay? So it could be things like maybe she couldn't have children, maybe she spoke to him the wrong way, maybe she didn't cook his food the way he liked it, or maybe she spoke to another man in public. Whatever it was, it turns out that Rabbi Hillel's views were the dominant views at the time of Jesus, okay? And that this practice, this view, became known as any cause divorce. Any cause divorce, that's the key. And so any cause divorce would have been the accepted understanding and the accepted practice in Jesus' day. And this would have been what the Pharisees would have been teaching. And it's all based on this passage way back here in Deuteronomy that we are unpacking right now. So to summarize my third observation, let me say it this way. The reasons for getting a divorce may have changed over the centuries, but any cause divorce seems to have been the accepted practice for pretty much all of the Jewish history. And you have to remember that all the divorce cards were still being held by the husband. So if you are a woman hearing me at this moment, let me ask you something. How do you think you would have felt living with this any cause divorce cloud hanging over you at all times? And how different is that from how we view divorce today? Okay, and the fourth point that I want to highlight is that the law in Deuteronomy chapter 24 was given to minimize the damage that divorce caused and to offer a measure of protection for the women who had no future unless they were officially freed from their previous marriages. As we've mentioned, a woman who was sent away by her husband without a certificate of divorce was still legally bound by her previous marriage covenant. And in Hebrew, that marriage covenant was called the ketubah. That's what it's called, the ketubah. So if a woman was sent away without an official get or certificate of divorce, any relationship with another man would definitely have been considered adulterous. And any man who married such a woman committed adultery, and he caused her to commit adultery as well. And the reason is simply because she's still legally married. Now, the sad fact of the matter in those days was that if a woman could not remarry after being sent away, her chances of survival were slim to none. If she did not have a man to take her in and to provide for her, it's quite possible that a woman's choice might have been, either prostitution or likely starve to death. Now, I realize that sounds like nasty and that sounds harsh, but that's what life was like for some women who found themselves sent away without a certificate of divorce. And, just the fact that this law was recorded tells us that men were obviously sending their wives away without a certificate of divorce, which was both cruel and selfish because obviously it robbed these women of any hope and of any future. And on top of this, many men in those days practiced polygamy, where they had multiple wives and then even concubines on top of that. So I'm sure you can see that with multiple wives and the tensions that would cause, it would be pretty easy to imagine wives just being sent away, right? And it only makes sense that some of these wives would have ended up abandoned or unwanted, especially when you're dealing with, multiple dozens of wives in some cases. I mean, I'm thinking of King Solomon here. Didn't he have 700 wives and 300 concubines? There is no way you can be a loving and a caring husband to hundreds of wives. I mean, most of us guys have a hard enough time being consistently loving and caring with one wife, right? So when you understand these cultural dynamics, you can see why this law would have provided at least some measure of protection for women, right? A legally divorced woman was allowed to remarry, which meant that she would be provided for and would probably even start another family. And so if you're starting to understand the culture and the plight of women in that day, maybe you can also see the mercy and the protection that was being extended towards women by legally restraining the impulses and the actions of some men. And my fifth point on this passage that I want to highlight is that the remarriage that is spoken of here was regarded by the law as a legitimate marriage. In fact, it was so legal and so legitimate that after the woman was remarried, she was never even allowed to go back to her first husband. Many people miss this. This remarriage covenant was as legitimate and as holy as the first one was. So really process this carefully. A remarriage is not invalidated by God here or anywhere else in the Bible, all right? Now, many of us have heard the argument that against this that goes something like this. Well, in man's eyes, they might be legally married, but in God's eyes, they are actually always married to the first person that they married. And any new relationship is unquestionably adulterous and wrong. Well, be careful when you hear people make bold statements like this and claiming to be able to see things clearly, quote unquote, through God's eyes. This passage here in Deuteronomy declares that this remarriage is indeed legitimate and that the women of that time who were redeemed from this life of loneliness into a good remarriage, they were indeed blessed women, okay? If these women were ever to be labeled as adulterous women, now this would have been the place in the scriptures to have made that clear, right? Right here. This is where we would want to see that. But we don't see any such thing here. So whatever you want to say about what God sees in this matter, these remarriages were not adulterous, okay? The fact that people were remarrying instead of getting stoned is quite telling. So my fifth and final observation, to summarize, of this Old Testament passage is that the remarriages that occurred in this prescribed manner were blessed by God. So tell me, in what way do these 5 observations challenge any of your previous assumptions about divorce and remarriage in the biblical context? Okay, now let's jump ahead to Malachi chapter 2, verse 16, which I said in a previous episode that I would come back to, and here we are. And there we read, "For I hate divorce, says the Lord, the God of Israel. To divorce your wife is to overwhelm her with cruelty, says the Lord of heaven's armies. So guard your heart and do not be unfaithful to your wife." So, we assume here from this that God hates divorce. Now let's continue on to an interesting passage that we have in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 8. There we read this. "The Lord said to me, have you seen what faithless Israel has done? She has gone up on every high hill and under every spreading tree and has committed adultery there. I thought that after she had done all this, she would return to me, but she did not. So I gave faithless Israel her certificate of divorce and sent her away because of all her adulteries." And then again in Isaiah chapter 50, the Lord asks the people of Israel, "Where is your mother's certificate of divorce with which I sent her away?" Now notice in both passages, the Lord specifically mentions the certificate of divorce and the sending away. Now, from what we've learned about the Jewish culture and the history and how divorce was carried out, this is a very serious statement for God to make against his own people. But here's the point I'm wanting to make. Could it be that God knows what being divorced feels like? If your own life story contains the pain and the trauma of divorce, how does this thought about God sit with you? Now, we know clearly that this is being said by God in a metaphorical sense, right? And at the end of the story, he ends up calling Israel back to himself. But nonetheless, he actually speaks some very drastic and serious words that makes people think very, very carefully about the severity of what they've done. I mean, if God divorces you, you're in a bad place, right? And my point is simply this. God seems to understand that there comes a point of no return in some relationships when the hardness of someone's heart has made meaningful relationship completely impossible, okay? And so I want to encourage you, God understands if you're in that situation. God is not the one who's down on you. In fact, he's rolling up his sleeves right now to help you, to be your source, to be your strength, to be the one who walks in when everyone else walks out. But the thing is, do you see him that way? So let's get back to Malachi now, shall we? I already mentioned that God hates divorce because of the pain and the trauma that it causes the people that he loves. But there's another layer, and there's some more here that I want to unpack for us, okay? For one thing, and this is a pretty minor point, the Hebrew word used here for divorce is once again the word shalach, which we already learned earlier means to send away. And it might or it might not imply the full process of divorce that was needed, that, included the certificate of divorce being handed to the wife, right? So I find it interesting that both the King James Version and the American Standard Version translate this word as putting away instead of divorce. The ASV actually says, "For I hate putting away, says Jehovah, the God of Israel." Now, this is a minor point of interest for me, and really the main message of this whole passage doesn't change at all, regardless of how you choose to understand the translation of this Hebrew word shalach. So you can choose to understand God speaking against the sending away that was being done, and you'd be fine in doing that. Or you can choose to understand God speaking against man's use of divorce as an excuse to continue in their hardness of heart, and you'd be fine in understanding it that way as well. Whatever you do with this passage, your understanding of this single word will not change the main take-home point, which actually packs a much more powerful punch anyways. Let's get into that part. Notice that Malachi says that for a man to divorce his wife or to put her away is to overwhelm her with cruelty. Do you hear those words? And this cruelty that's being condemned by the Lord here is the practice of men treating women like disposable objects rather than as being equals in this sacred covenant of marriage that God established in the beginning. So this was written as a warning to men of how their systemic attitude towards women and their treatment of women was a complete abomination to the Lord, okay? God is calling their system of any cause divorce an act of cruelty towards women. That's what's going on here. You see, men had been using this law of Moses that we just studied in Deuteronomy as a loophole to systematically oppress women and yet to still hide behind the law and pretend to be right with God. And right here is where God was calling them to account. They had ignored their responsibility to honor their marriage covenants and to be faithful to their wives, and had instead started dishonoring their wives, treating them more like disposable objects and trading them like cards. You see how that plays into this passage and how that can really, kind of evoke strong words from the Lord. And it's this cruelty against women that God is condemning here. And this attitude of cruelty towards women was widely accepted. That's why I call it a systemic cruelty. And there's evidence from ancient Jewish writings, both in the Bible and outside of the Bible, that prove that this attitude was very much alive and systemic at the time of Jesus as well. Do you think it's still alive today? Well, let's try a modern example. Let's take a look at the modern pornography industry today. And this multi-billion-dollar industry is thriving. Why? Through the exploitation and through the degradation of women. So when the stats tell us that 65 to 80% of Christian men are consuming pornography regularly, who are the people that are judging these single moms whose lives are being shattered by divorce? Tell me that. Is there not a systemic white elephant in our very midst that needs to be called to the mat also? So I would say that this is a modern reflection of the same cruelty that Malachi is condemning in the men of Israel in his day. The same lust drives both realities, and I'm sure you can see that quite easily. So the main message of this passage in Malachi is that it's a warning to the men of Israel that their systemic attitudes towards women stinks. It totally stinketh in King James language. And so God is speaking up boldly on behalf of women in a very patriarchal culture, almost as if you could almost say he's issuing a divine protection order for them, warning each and every man in verse 16 to guard your heart and do not be unfaithful to your wife. That's an exact quote from the last part of verse 16. And now here's why this main message needs to be clearly understood by us. You see, this passage has been used in modern times against men and women who have been victims of divorce by boldly proclaiming that God hates divorce. Now, can you see how this simple phrase misses the whole point of this verse? And the message that divorced people get, for the most part, is that God hates you. And that, my friends, is a very wrong application of this passage. And I hope that your heart tells you that this is a wrong way to use this passage. Because when that's being said, it's as if God is being set up against those who are suffering under the burden and the shame and the trauma of divorce. You know, I once had a broken single mom tell me in the midst of her pain, I never, ever wanted divorce to be a part of my story. You can hear that they already hate the ramifications of divorce in their own lives. They don't need to be told that it is something that is painful and traumatic. So now tell me, is using this passage in this judgmental way accurately reflecting the heart of the Father to these single moms who are in pain? I don't think so. Using this passage to add condemnation to women who are enduring this painful season in their lives is really to twist its original message and to add shame and condemnation where the Father's heart is actually all about protection and safety and compassion. You can't just lift this passage out of its, Old Testament context and then apply it in a blanket fashion to any and all modern cases of relational breakdown and divorce and declare that God hates it all. This is a very specific condemnation here of how men viewed and treated women, but they still use the Bible to conveniently cover up their shameful attitudes, okay? So if you want to apply this passage to modern situations of divorce today, at least start by using it to defend the weak and the vulnerable in situations where you are helping hurting people to navigate marital breakdowns in their lives, be it men or women. Always lean in the direction of the Father's heart as we've learned it through Jesus. And always make clear the Father's affection and affirmation of people who are stuck in these traumatic situations. That's how you apply Malachi to today. You support and defend the victims, the weak and the vulnerable, and you speak against any cruelty aimed at them. So maybe you're the one going through a separation or a divorce right now, and you've been praying and praying for an answer, and things only seem to be getting worse. And to top it all off, then you get a Bible passage like this one from Malachi thrown at you in a condemning or a judgmental way. Well, I want to assure you that this is not the heart of the Father that's being expressed towards you at all. You are hearing the same religious voices that Jesus had to silence again and again as he challenged the Pharisees of his day. I think the truth that you need to hear in your struggle would be what Isaiah prophesied about the coming of Jesus when he said that a bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not extinguish. Maybe you feel like that bruised reed or like that smoldering wick, and your flame is about to go out. And you need to know that you are 100% safe with the Lord in his presence. You may not be safe with religious people, but don't let their condemning chatter against you cloud your understanding of the Father's heart towards you. Not everyone waving a Bible in your face is speaking God's truth to you, okay? So no matter how dark today might look, I want to assure you that you are not abandoned, you are not forsaken, and you are not forgotten. The Lord is for you and not against you, and he has a hope and a future for you. That's his redemptive specialty. Now, I know that we've said a lot here today, and my prayer for you is that you get a very real sense of the tenderness of the Father as wave after wave of compassion and grace cover you and redeem your brokenness as you sense the Lord's goodness taking over more and more of your thinking. The bottom line is that the Father's favor is all over you, even when you don't feel it or you can't see it. So I hope you've been encouraged today, and we will continue our chat in part 4.